Well, welcome back to another class on the book of Romans. As we continue our study just through the text this quarter, we're coming to the last few chapters of the book. And as if you've been following along with our classes, you know that we're not having physical classes right now at Pepper Road. And so we're continuing our studies through these recordings for now, hoping to get back to meeting together very soon. And we certainly are keeping everyone in our prayers that there'll be quick recoveries for everyone. And so far, we're glad to hear that no one is having any severe complications. Everyone seems to be moving in the right direction. So we're very thankful for that. We've been looking at the second half. It's not really second half, but second portion of the book of Romans as we make that transition from sort of a building of doctrinal arguments, now looking at the consequences of the building of those arguments. And so much of the arguments really have to do with the Jews making an adjustment about how they see themselves and about how they see Gentile Christians, and reframing that whole thing in their minds to repair relationships. It may even be looking at the historical context. It may even be that Jewish Christians are coming back into Rome from the exile that had occurred earlier, and as they're coming back into Rome, they're seeing that really it's a Gentile church now. You know, what had maybe started as a Jewish Christian church is now more of a predominantly Gentile church, and maybe that's caused some of that tension to particularly rise to the surface. But whatever has caused it, Paul has spent a great deal of time clarifying so much about the nature of the law and how that law relates to and brings us to Christ. And one of the things that we noted in chapter 12 is that much of what Paul is saying here, in fact, the very foundations of what Paul is saying here, are built on the premises that were laid out in the law. So that faithful Jewish Christians, faithful Jews, should see Christianity as a natural extension of what they had already been doing. Unfaithful Jews, or Jews who had a perverted notion of the law and relationship with God through that perversion of their view of the law, would find Christianity to be jolting, but frankly, they would find an accurate presentation of the law to be jolting. And so as Paul is coming through and leaning on this instruction about love, he is doing so, I think, appealing to consistency, appealing to the consistency of the law as it is revealed, bringing us to Christ, and so that Christ is that fulfillment. Christ is simply bringing to fruition all the things that God has been saying this whole time. In chapter 12, I think he focuses on those internal relationships. We talked about that. Just a moment ago, before we started this recording, we were talking about Romans 13 and how that discussion of government fits in. And it does seem to depart from the internal focus for just a moment. And then he comes back to the internal focus later in 13. And certainly that's where we are in chapter 14. Marshall pointed out that at the end of chapter 12, he's talking about vengeance. And then there we are in chapter 13 talking about the instrument of vengeance. Here's how God brings that about. But what about you? You focus not on being that judge, the one who is the arbiter of justice and revenge, but rather you focus on love, on maintaining the relationships and maintaining unity among the brethren, and let God be the one who brings judgment where it is needed. Well, chapter 14 really highlights that, I think. As we're coming into chapter 14, it is very much about not putting ourselves in a place of judgment where we do not belong, that we allow God to be in his place. Chapter 13, allow the government to be in their place, and for us to understand what our role is and where our positioning is in regards to our brethren, and particularly with some specific issues or a category of issues when it comes to our brethren. So we'll be looking at that this morning or evening or whatever time it is that you're watching this video, and trying to work through a passage that I think gets some misusage from time to time, but ought to be a great blessing for us and a great help for us in maintaining our relationships with one another. So let's get into the text there in chapter 14 and beginning in verse 1. We're going to spend a little bit of time here on these first few verses as we're trying to set the stage, I think, really for the rest of what Paul says in this chapter. He says, "So, now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purposes of, or for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinion." All right. Now, as we start here, just at the very beginnings here, as we're getting into this instruction, Paul is directing the instruction. I think we have two classes of people sort of under discussion here. Now, as we get along in the verses, we may see that who belongs in which class can change from time to time. But we have two classes. Which class of people is the instruction particularly being directed at here at the beginning of the passage? Brad, what do you think about that?
Well, in that he says, receive one who is weak in the faith, he must be addressing someone who is stronger in the faith, or at least who believes that he is stronger in the faith. And I think that we'll end up exploring more about that as we get farther down into the chapter.
Yes, yeah. And so as far as defining who is weak and defining who is strong, we're going to talk more about that. But I do think it's important right off the bat to understand that, it's like when we talk to our children and of various ages. Marshall's got a pretty good array of ages in his house. And I imagine when he speaks to his oldest son versus his youngest son, that he holds his oldest son to a higher standard. There's an expectation there. And what you really want to do is develop in him an expectation of himself, not just that you hold him to higher expectation, but he holds himself to higher expectation. And so, as Brad alluded to, there may be some measure of they think they're the stronger ones. Well, if they do, then they ought to act like they think they're the stronger ones. That's one of the things that we find with siblings, maybe who are not so far in age, but one feels pretty certain they're the boss. Usually if they're just a couple of years older and I'm older and I'm more mature. Okay, well, then some expectations come along with that. If you are so much older and so much more mature, then you ought to be acting like you are older and more mature. Here's this person that you think is weaker. You're not treating them like you think they're weaker. You're treating them with disdain, but not with the compassion that should go along with that view. And so whether or not that person is actually stronger or whether it is they just think that they're stronger, either way, I think what Paul is doing is placing the burden, the greatest burden, on the side of the one who takes on that role. Whoever is in the position of, I have the greater maturity here, I have the greater knowledge or understanding, okay, then you have more responsibility. That's really, usually people think of the greater maturity or whatever in terms of privileges. But of course here that's greater responsibility. Okay. So we set our premise there. We're directing our attention to the one who's standing up saying, I've got the stronger view on this. Okay. Well, then you've got responsibilities. Verse 2, one person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. All right. So as far as, so now we've categorized or we've described a little bit who the stronger is, right? So this is not nebulous, right? We're not as far as strong and weak, he's not just leaving that completely out there for personal interpretation, but he gives us a little bit of something to go on here. And so what is the nature of this, Marshall? Who do you think are the characters at play here?
Well, just to speak from the text, first of all, he says that the weak individual is the one who eats only vegetables. Individuals. He eats vegetables. But the stronger one thinks that he can eat meats. Now, in the context of the book of Romans that you've already laid out throughout the book, it appears that, the one who would eat meats would probably be either the Gentile or maybe the Jew who has adopted that kind of a lifestyle, but probably the Gentile. And the weaker one would be the one who said you can't eat certain kinds of meats, maybe because of uncleanness and things like that. And so I would take that his reference is probably Gentiles versus Jews, which has been the problem all the way through, or at least the issue all the way through. And he is trying to say that the weaker individual is one who does not recognize the liberty that comes from the gospel, that God has not bound these food laws anymore. But as far as if you want me to go on to the next part of the question, I think what has been indicated all the way through, though it's often focused on circumcision, in Romans and Galatians, it seems that Paul has laid out a case that God's will is either course is fine. Not if you don't bind one or the other, then either course is fine. And so that does put it in the realm of opinions, as you mentioned in verse 1.
Yeah, and we're gonna and absolutely we're gonna press even further to that in just a moment as we get into verse 3. But as you say, that either is fine. I think it's interesting. Brad and I were talking before earlier this morning, and the idea of who is being talked about here. There are a couple of options. It could be that you do have the Jews who have the weaker conscience here, and the Gentiles have the stronger conscience because they've not been restricted. As we go over to Corinthians, we see that maybe it's the Jews who had the stronger conscience about things offered to idols, and maybe it's the Gentiles who have the scruple of, look, I know what that's about, and I've been too close to that, and I can't eat those things. It's hard to say, but I think maybe that's helpful in us applying this. Sometimes it is hard to say what issue may make this brother stronger versus another issue that may make this brother stronger. If it is in fact the Jews in this case where they are the stronger who won't eat meat offered to idols, which would be different than Marshall's suggestion is that we're talking about restricted meats under the law, right? So then Gentiles would be eating those restricted meats. Here it would be more of, and this is why I would lean in this direction, is because he turns to vegetables only. I think the idea would be you're talking about a society in which it would be impossible to know whether meat being sold in the marketplace had been offered to idols. And the assumption is that it probably, there's a high likelihood that it had. And so in order to avoid that, you just have to avoid meat altogether. Just to eat vegetables, right? And so that makes me lean a little bit in that direction, suggesting here. If that's the case, then maybe a little bit later in the text, we start talking about the regarding of days. That's almost certainly talking about Jews. Because if pagans are regarding days, then they would be regarding idolatrous days. In other words, we're talking about pagan festivals and celebrations. We know that's not acceptable. But for a Jew who would want to maintain keeping the Sabbath, that's perfectly acceptable behavior, but it's not required behavior. And so maybe the tables are flipped right here within the text. That we start out with the stronger being the Jew, the weaker being the Gentile, and then later on it's the Gentile who's stronger and the Jew which would be a really great illustration for Jews who are having trouble getting along and assume that they probably assume in every case they're the stronger. And so as we start with the case where maybe they're the stronger, and then a little bit later in the text, oh wait, you're saying that people who don't keep the Sabbath could be stronger? Yeah, well, in a sense, yeah, they're the ones who are not adding a restriction and not having a weak conscience that requires a greater restriction than what God does. But coming back to the question, one thing that I would note as far as applying this, as far as taking this on out, the weaker person in the context of Romans 14 is adding a burden that God has not. Ultimately, that's what we see. Here's someone who is putting an additional burden on themselves that God has not required. Now that is acceptable, right? For us to go beyond or require more of ourselves than God has required. And I think that it's important that we have that definition, because as people begin to attempt to broadly apply this passage, one of the things that they'll do, as they sort of just say, "Oh, that's a Romans 14 issue," is they'll apply that to people who are loosing where God has not loosed, who are requiring less than God requires. That's nowhere in Romans 14, right? No person in Romans 14 is removing instruction that God has bound, saying we don't actually have to do what God has required. So that's important. That's an important distinction. And when you get into that area, we're no longer talking about personal scruples. We're not talking about somebody whose conscience requires more of them. We're talking about someone who is disregarding the instructions of God, the requirements of God. And so we need to keep that context. We've been talking all through the book of Romans about anchor principles, anchor verses as we're going through particular chapters. That's what I'm wanting to suggest here, is that these first few verses give us some serious anchors that will keep us from going adrift on where we might apply Romans chapter 14. So we have someone who has a stronger scruple, a stronger restriction than what God has required. That ends up being the weaker brother in the context of the discussion of Romans 14. Well, to take that question of God's will concerning these things a little bit further, well, let me pause there. Marshall, looking at that question of God's will, what has God revealed about the eating of meats?
Well, as you pointed out, if you have a couple of different options, if it's the Jews eating meats, the rules of uncleanness have been abolished by Jesus and by his apostles. But if it's the Gentiles, there are still some restrictions. Acts 15, that there are certain meats that you are not supposed to eat. And so either way, God has spoken, but he's also given a little bit of leeway regarding certain eating of meats. And so I guess it would depend on who you take to be maybe the stronger brother here, and what restrictions or lack of restrictions there might be.
Yeah, and so it's not that God said nothing on these things. And I guess that's my point, is that God has given instruction, right? So it's not like we don't know if we can eat those or not. He told us, arise, Peter, kill and eat. He was very explicit with regards to what he told Peter. And so we see that clarity. And even in the case of the idols, it's more about your proximity to the idol than the meat itself. You could, in fact, in several instances, actually eat the meat that's offered to idols, depending on what that does to your acceptance of the idolatry. And your proximity to the idolatry. You can't go to the idol's table. You can't eat that meat if it offends the conscience. But that's not about the meat itself. That's about the surrounding circumstances of the meat. And so with regards to God's specific revelation, you can eat meat. That's distinct and definitive. And yet somebody goes, I don't feel it. I don't think I can. Okay. All right. Then that's what defines weaker here. God says you can. You don't feel like you can. It doesn't say you have to. We're not talking about that. He says you can. It's permissive. And I think that's another thing. God's will in this is permissive, that he allows these things, but then we do not allow our own conscience. Okay, coming into verse 3 then. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. All right, so here, and this is getting more into the nature of what Marshall was answering there, which was a different take on the question than what I was pressing there. But Brad, what is God's position on both of these individuals, the weak and the strong?
Well, it says very clearly, God has received him. So God is okay with both of them, just so long as they do not press their views, their practices on the brethren on the other side, if you will.
Yes.
That's when we start to get into trouble.
Yeah. So what we've got here is the activity itself will not bring you into judgment. And so where we have an activity that is that is outside or a rejection of God, that is a rejection of his pattern, that God specifically says he'll reject, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about issues where God says he accepts. I mean, and Paul explicitly says he has accepted him, right? There's no question about that. And so again, what we're talking about, that people will talk about Romans 14 from the standpoint of, patience, and give him time and maybe he'll come along. And I think there's a place for that. Romans 14 is not the place to go for that. In this case, here's a person who eats vegetables. If they eat vegetables for the rest of their lives, they'll be fine. God has accepted him. That does not apply to something that if somebody does not change, that they will be rejected. And so I do understand having patience with people who have not really repented. They've not, we're working on them. We're studying with them. We're praying for their growth and acceptance of God's will. But if it is a matter that they must eventually change, that they must move past in order to be received by God, then it's not Romans 14. Romans 14 is for a matter that if somebody wants to maintain that weaker conscience, that in some ways that stronger conscience from the standpoint of more severe, then that's okay. When we think about the Rechabites, the Rechabites were used by Jeremiah as an example to unfaithful Israel. And they're used as an example of people who were faithful to their earthly father. And as a result, seem to have benefited spiritually by being the weaker brethren, right? So they restricted themselves from things that God had specifically told Israel that they were permitted to enjoy. But here where the Rechabites said, we will not enjoy those things. We will not live in houses. We will not plant vineyards, right? So they're restricting themselves from blessings that are available to them. And what's the result? Well, not only did they not let go of those restrictions for all these many generations, but in fact, maintaining those restrictions were it seems, some of the very things that kept them faithful to God in a world, in a culture surrounded by people who, by virtue of those very blessings that they partook in, they allowed those things to become a curse and to detract them from God, to distract them from God. So here are people who, for their greater conscience, their greater scruples, weaker brethren, who ended up in a stronger position because they maintained that, quote, weakness. I think that's so important, that for some people, they can maintain a better relationship to God by pursuing this path. It's fine. It's fine for them to pursue that path for the rest of their lives. They can even institute it in generational terms, and that may be of value. All of this, again, anchor point. We're fastening it down, battening it down, and you can only take this so far. And if you start going to a place where you say, I'm going to apply this to a circumstance in which here's somebody doing something wrong, but I'm going to use Romans 14 to suggest we need to be patient with that person. Well, you do need to be patient with that person, but not because of Romans 14. Romans 14 is talking about the guy who you need to learn to live with. You need to learn to live with his different choices that are accepted by God. And so we're anchoring that down.
Stephen?
Yes.
Just a quick comment. I like the way one of my mentors, L.A. Stouffer, he has a lesson I really like on Romans 14. And he starts out as he's going through these first couple of verses and says, whatever is being taught here is not going to contradict with Paul's teaching in chapter 16 that says if someone is doing something wrong and creating division and dissension, you mark that person.
Yeah.
So, whatever it's talking about here is not talking about things that would lead to division and withdrawal from an individual.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good, right, side by side, right? And of course, it's not going to contradict anything Paul writes anywhere else, but much less right here in the same letter in just a couple of more pages. So, absolutely. And as we get farther along in the text, and something Brad alluded to in his answer, he said, as long as you don't press that. The issue is not the practice itself, right? If someone is lost, if someone is rejected by God about these circumstances, it won't be whether you ate meat or not. It will be your attitude about it. And so as we're going down through here, we're talking about practices that are perfectly acceptable and attitudes that are not. And so the practice itself is not an issue. But how we go about practicing that, and then how we act towards other people who don't practice the same as us, that is the issue. But the practice itself, accepted and justified, justifiable before God. Okay. One more question on verse 3. And we just I just talked about it a little bit, but what attitudes are dangerous on each side here, as we define that a little bit more? Marshall, as you continue on through the text here, what's the danger for the weak brother? What's the danger for the strong brother?
So there in verse 3, you do have the idea of contempt. And I think that's really the issue here. And maybe to bring in something somewhat synonymous is there could be a bitterness that develops, which would result in a greater division. And if both are accepted by God, then they need to accept one another rather than letting this be a wedge that divides between them. But it seems to be that anytime you have bitterness, at least on one side or the other or both, there's going to be some level of pride about certain position or action. And that's just a terrible combination. When you have pride and bitterness, it's always going to lead to some kind of division.
Yeah, yeah, and so on the strong, it's sort of a looking down, right, from the strong. That contempt is that idea. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt. But then on the other direction, it's judgment. Right. So contempt, pride, looking down. There's another source of pride that looks over and judges and from the standpoint of condemnation. That's really the terminology here. That's the word judgment is usually translated condemnation. So you have contempt in one direction. You have condemnation in the other direction. And as Marshall said, both of those very often are rooted in a prideful attitude. Okay, we're going to see that more as we go along through the following verses. So picking up in verse 5, one person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord. He who eats does so for the Lord. He who gives he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not, for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. It's Paul is firmly shifting the attention. And where is he shifting that attention to, Brad?
In one word, God.
Yes.
Why are you doing what you're doing? If the fellow who refuses to eat meats is doing that because he says, I don't want to get anywhere close to doing something that might offend my God, or that might get in between me and my God, you can't do anything but admire that man, not hold him in contempt. And the person who does eat meats, he's giving thanks to God for those things that God has blessed him with. And so if we maintain the focus on God, instead of judging or holding our brothers in contempt, if we focus on pleasing God, this will all work out fine, I think is what he's getting at there. think you're still muted, Stephen.
Again, that's not to say, at all that if you focus on pleasing God, then it doesn't matter what you do. That's nonsensical kind of language, really. But the idea is legitimately. If you're legitimately have that focus, not like a perverse focus like the Jews who, certainly believed that they were trying to please God, but at the end of the day, that's not really where their focus was. So we're talking about a legitimate shifting of focus, and again, maintaining those anchor points. If we're talking about areas where it doesn't matter, from the standpoint of an eternal perspective, which of these paths you take, well then, as long as your focus is towards God in those things, that's all that matters. I think about this from what Paul has to say to Timothy about eating and the act of marital sex. He says there are people who come along and say that who portray these as sinful things in and of themselves. They're fleshly, and they sort of are preaching an asceticism, an extreme asceticism about these things. Essentially, they are people who would preach against pleasure and enjoyment. And I mean that literally. I mean, sometimes we have a lot of people today who would sort of preach from a different perspective. If it tastes good, then you need to spit it out. But that's not so much spiritual, although maybe there's some overlap for some people. But it is more, that's more about physical. But there were people who thought that pleasure in and of itself was an anti-spiritual thing to be going through. Well, certainly we could make a case for the spiritual value of pain. But what we can't make a case for is the pursuit of pain. And having enjoyment and pleasure, that can be valuable too, and that's what Paul says in the context there as he's talking to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 4, if you're giving thanks to God for those things, then it is spiritual, right? Then that pleasure is spiritual. So here's a person who enjoys the pleasure of eating meat. If he gives thanks to God, why then that is something that helps him in his relationship to God. Here's a person who rejects meat. And if he does so because he is trying to draw nearer to God, well, you can do that too. You can draw near to God by refusing meat. Here is a person who says, I'm going to devote this day to God. And I'm going to not do any work on this day. Well, obviously, we have a pattern in which we see throughout the Old Testament that there is great value in that. That's why God gave that day to the people. But here in the New Testament, that is unnecessary, but it's still helpful. So if somebody wants to take that day and give that wholly to the Lord, then that's fine. If another person realizes that that day is unnecessary and does not observe that day, but remembers God all the same in his work, in every effort, in his leisure, and whatever he's doing with that day, well, then he can use that in his relationship with God. And so on these issues, it's not even a matter of you can do it or not do it. It's that you can gain value in your relationship to God, whichever of these paths you take. But you can also destroy your relationship to God, whichever of these paths you take. And so that goes back to the attitudes that we're talking before. The question is, in these things, are you doing this while looking over at your brother going, I do this, but you don't. And because you don't, either that means you're weaker, that you don't have the kind of strong relationship with God that I have, or it means that you're not as spiritual and you don't care about God as much as I do, or you would give up the sorts of things that I give up. And either one of those, your focus in what you're doing is not God, but your brother. And so that's that shift that has to occur. It's not looking over at someone else as I'm engaging or not engaging in this activity, but rather that my focus is pointed towards God as we're engaging this. Now, as we continue on through the next several verses, he really presses in on this thought. So, for not one of us lives for himself, and no one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord. Or if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end, Christ died and lived again, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and of the living. But you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God. So then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or stumbling block in a brother's way. So if there is a focus towards my brother, it is only a focus that is meant towards helping him, right? My focus towards him is, what can I do to help his relationship to God? We might just note that again, in verse 10, it mentions the both sides there. Why do you judge your brother, right? That's the weaker brother condemning. Why do you regard your brother with contempt? That's the stronger brother looking down on. So both cases, right? In any case, when you take this attitude, here is your focus on the horizontal plane, and it's a focus that will destroy your relationship, not only with that brother, but as a result with God. Now, as we look at those verses, no one lives for himself, no one dies for himself. We are the Lord's. It's his to judge. He's the king. Everyone will bow before him. What are some ways that those verses can kind of be taken and run with? Marshall, what have you heard along the lines of, it's God's to judge?
Well, if you mean running in the wrong direction,
Yeah.
There are people who have taken this passage, I mean, all of Romans 14, but specifically this passage just said, God's the ultimate judge. So I don't need to judge any action. I just need to accept my brother. Whatever he's doing, he might be doing it to the Lord, and that's just fine. But again, often that is because they, as you pointed out, are loosing something that God has bound. This other person is doing something that God has not authorized, maybe in their specific congregation or even in their own individual life. And because it is easier not to work through those differences, as we talked about in our Thursday night class, because it's easier to just have some kind of false fellowship. I just use this as an out of God's going to judge. That's good enough. And so I don't need to make any judgments. And yet what we need to keep in mind is there are good and bad judgments, and there are good and bad views of our brethren as we're trying to both reach heaven. And we need to make sure that when it's something that is doctrinal, that is moral, we need to make sure we are holding a line there and we are helping our brethren come in the right understanding there. But if it's a matter that doesn't matter, there is that, willingness to tolerate one another in those things. But usually for those who are running with it in the wrong direction, it's taking something that is a matter of doctrine or morality, and they're just letting loose.
And thinking about that, as one of the anchor points we talked about at the beginning is the burden on the stronger. But as we've gone throughout, we see that all along there is instruction to the weaker as well, right? The not condemning, and so it does go both directions. And I would suggest that as we're going through this, there's responsibility on both sides, and this is not permission for somebody with a stronger conscience to come in and let their judging conscience be the guiding principle for everyone. That essentially what we do is make all of our practice come into compliance with the weakest among us. That's not what Paul is going for here. I think what he's going for here is pressing a tolerance, as you say, in every direction. And if that guy over there is eating meat, learn to love that brother that's eating meat, and recognize your own scruples here is an implication in that. And so I just add that towards the weaker. Now, let me say this along those lines. The weaker in these cases who's not eating meats. How might we frame that? How might, if somebody is not eating those meats, whether it's the Jews who are holding on to the restrictions under the law, or whether it's the Gentiles who can't get their minds away from even the potential association with idolatry. What sort of a case do you think they would make in order to for themselves, in order to explain that to someone else, you suppose? Can you think of maybe some examples today where we might have some similar cases that we might make in one direction or another? Brad, what do you think?
Well, maybe just to take a modern example where I think that there's some judgment that's involved. We've got here next month Halloween coming up, and some people take a very, very strong view on saying, no, we can't participate in that at all because it has pagan roots. And other people say, oh no, that's there's not really a problem with it. Nobody really associates it with paganism anymore. And I think there's room for a lot of judgment and a lot of grace, the same kind of patience, if you will, or maybe patience is not the right word, but at least refraining from judgment and contempt on our part with people either who simply refuse outright to participate in that sort of thing, or those who decide that they might, and it's probably fine. In other words, if I'm dressing up as a knight or as Iron Man or something like that, there's nothing that's inherently wrong about that, and going from door to door and asking for candy. If I start dressing up as demons and ghosts, or if I come from a background in which that sort of thing was very, very prominent, and I just cannot separate the day with the practice, no matter how innocent it is, well, then I think it's fine for that person to abstain. But we need to be careful about just how much we press on our brethren along those lines. And I think we also need to, he's going to say here in just a little bit, don't destroy the work of God by eating meats. I think we need to have some restraint in our own exercise of liberty, taking into account how it's going to affect the conscience of our brother who might be more hesitant along those lines.
Yes. And so one thing, as you're talking there about that particular instance, the person who would be against that would make a spiritual case for that. It's not just, I just don't prefer it. It's stronger than that. And I would say that would be the case with the eating of meats. Is somebody is not just saying, I just don't prefer, no, I don't think I can do that. And I think they would use scripture to back up why they couldn't do that. They would talk about some of the very things Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians. Now I think they would take it farther than Paul takes it, but they would say, all right, we're supposed to stay away from idolatry. How far? Well, I think they march farther than Paul marches, but it's all under the principle, the true biblical principle of we're supposed to stay away from idolatry. They might look at the old law. If it's the Jews, they might look at the old law and say, listen, aren't we supposed to be a clean people? And God used these things to teach us how to be clean. I'm just supposed to dismiss that? I'm supposed to just forget that God used these very things as instructors on how to be clean and unclean? And so I think they would be very strong in their views of those things in order to refrain from this. And it would be a biblical case, if you will, or an attempt at a biblical case. And my point there is that here, as Paul is instructing these people, he's not saying, don't get on each other about things that are mere preference. I don't think these things are mere preference. I think these are strongly held convictions. They're personal convictions at the end of the day. And so the burden on the weaker brother is to recognize the line that must be drawn between what we can clearly say, God does not allow this, versus moving past what God has clearly said over into, in order for me to follow what God has clearly said, I'm going to go and add this extra part that God has not clearly said. Okay, that's fine. But you can't use that standard over your brother. And you can't judge your brother on the basis of that standard. Somebody says, listen, here's what I think of if I celebrate Halloween. Here's the mindset. Here's the things I feel like it associates me with. Don't you think God says we shouldn't associate with those things? And you could see the argument. Yes, I do. But you have stepped away from God's clear revelation over into an application of that. I was talking to a fella about another holiday one time, and he asked me what my thoughts were on it, and I told him what my thoughts were, and he said, well, we just think we ought not to be pagans. And I said, I do too. I think we ought not to be pagans as well. But he was so certain that absolutely did make us pagans. And it was interesting because he used that strong language, but then at the same time, he didn't draw lines of fellowship. And I thought, if you really thought that made us pagans, I hope you would withdraw from us. That would be a place to draw a line. And so we've got to be careful. We got to be careful in our language about these things. And when somebody has that scruple, we don't want to talk about them like they're being silly. I do want to appreciate and understand why someone would be frightened or uncertain about this area, and so as to be compassionate and tolerant, truly tolerant of this brother of mine, not just like tolerate them in a condescending sort of a way, but actually an accepting tolerance, sort of like what the world preaches, but in this case, what we ought to be doing, which is accepting tolerantly those who love the Lord and are faithfully serving Him. So I just say that it's hard work, and it's more than just saying, oh, it's just a matter of opinion. It's more than that. This is not paint colors. This is not preferences in style. This is conviction. And so we really have to work hard to draw those lines and make those distinctions about where we must draw lines and where we must say, I cannot fellowship this, versus, no, I can, and I really ought to fellowship this, even though that's not the way I would do things. That really, this ends up being a personal application of if we back up, the more clear instruction, then this is personally how I'm applying that distinct from what clear application is that everyone must abide by. Well,
Hey, Stephen, could I
yeah.
add one thing just to tie the previous paragraph to this? Is that a lot of times I think we look at some of those things, maybe even holidays, and we're focused on that the negative, those in the negative would say, I can't do this because of my relationship with God. But it also places a burden, a responsibility on the person who says that they actually think about how giving thanks to God for that. And let's say it's Halloween, that they had better give thanks that God has put them in a community where they could enjoy one another, or that they get this treat, whatever it might be. But sometimes we just think of, what do I get out of this whenever I'm the quote unquote strong one? And really it should all be about, what can I give to God because of this?
Yeah, and absolutely. I think that's going to be pressed right at the end as we talk about doing things in faith. But that idea of the charge, I think, would be very often from the weak towards the strong, is that you're not as spiritual, right? What you're doing is not as spiritually minded as what I'm doing. And that's a false charge, but it could be a true charge. Not because you're doing that thing, but because you're doing it with no recognition of God. And if you're eating meat because you're dismissive of what God has said about that, and you don't care what God has said about that, well, then then the charge is true, that you're not spiritually minded, not for the reasons they say necessarily, but for the reason Paul says, that you're not thinking about God in what you're doing. We'll talk more about that as we get towards the end of the chapter. But even though, in a technical sense, we have no time constraints, I'm going to constrain us. And we're coming up on the hour here. So we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up in verse 14 and look at the last few questions in our lesson in our next recording. And hopefully that will leave us some time for a review. I'd like to, we weren't scheduled to have a Bible class this midweek. And so, because we were supposed to have a gospel meeting. So I'm going to take that opportunity for us to have a review and kind of set in place an overview of everything Paul has said up to this point, and try to keep us maintaining some perspective of the overall argument and arch of what Paul is saying throughout this letter. Really appreciate you guys joining me today and participating in the recording. Hope it's been helpful for all of our members and those others who may be watching and joining along with us. Lord willing, we will either make another recording for Wednesday night or we'll have a live class. We'll see what the future holds in the next few days. But appreciate you joining us at any rate. Hope you'll join us again as we continue through the rest of the book of Romans. Thanks so much.